Yay, there we are. I can see everyone. I wasn't sure. Where is everyone? There's always that delay. Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where you are joining us from. I am Katherine Webber. I am the author of The Revelry and Twin Crowns. And most importantly, I am a huge, huge fan of the three authors who are sitting next to me virtually tonight. I'm so excited that we are all here to celebrate the UK release of Our Crooked Hearts by Melissa Albert. Melissa is a New York bestselling Times author of, I was going to say House of Hollow, which is Krystal Sutherland, The Hazelwood, and also the following books. And this is her newest one, and it is amazing. Next to her is Krystal Sutherland, who is also the New York Times bestselling author of The House of Hollow. Guys, you guys are obviously like on my brain combining your books, also Crooked Hearts and Chemical Hearts. I'm obviously getting us we are all on the same level, but very excited to have Krystal here. And then Victoria Schwab, who is the New York Times bestselling author of many, many books, and most recently, Gallant. This is it beautifully under the dust jacket, but it's gorgeous. And yeah, so tonight, to let everyone know how this is going to go, I will be asking us some questions, and then there will be audience questions. So if you have an audience question, make sure you put those in the Q&A. If anyone is having any technical difficulties, Waterstones are also on standby to help with that. And of course, reminder, you can buy all of these books from Waterstones. So hooray, hooray for Melissa. Congratulations on your UK launch. Yay.
Yay.
Thank you for wanting to do this event. For anyone who is not familiar with Our Crooked Hearts, do you want to let everyone know what it's about?
Yes, I do. Okay, so Our Crooked Hearts is the story of two girls. The first is Ivy, and she is a contemporary suburban teen who is noticing her life becoming stranger and stranger, and she realizes that it is connected to the story of her mother, Dana, and her own teen years growing up in 1990 Chicago. And when Dana was 16, she sort of descended into an increasingly dark journey into magic. And now 25 years later, the things that happened to her when she was 16 are coming back to haunt her daughter. So the story is kind of about those stories in tandem and then the ways that they collide. So it's like magic with consequences, which is my favorite thing.
And it's exciting and pacey and beautifully written. And I loved it so, so much. So I'm so happy it's out in the world and everyone can discover it. You'll never look at rabbits the same way. And then for anyone who hasn't had the pleasure of reading Gallant, Victoria, if you could let everyone know what that one is about as well.
Sure. Here it is with the cover on. My publicity would be very mad if I didn't do that. Yeah, Gallant is my latest novel. It's a standalone novel, and it's a story of a teenage girl named Olivia Pryor who has spent most of her life in an orphanage. She knows nothing of her family. All she has is a journal that seems to descend into madness and warns her that she'll be safe as long as she doesn't go home to a place called Gallant. Until one day, an uncle she's never met invites her home to Gallant. She gets there, finds no uncle, a house falling into disrepair, a garden being strangled to death by strange weeds, and a locked door in a wall that seems to lead nowhere. So it's a dark fairy tale.
And it's gorgeous. I love all of your books, but I especially really enjoyed this one. It was just like delicious to sink into. And then Krystal, for anyone who doesn't know, House of Hollow, or as I was calling Melissa's book, your book.
It's interchangeable, it's fine.
Yeah. Excellent books. Yeah, read one, read the other. If you want to let everyone know what House of Hollow is all about.
Yeah, sure. So House of Hollow is the story of three sisters, the Hollow sisters, who went missing for a month when they were children. They disappeared off a street in Edinburgh on New Year's Eve, and they came back a month later with no memory of where they had been or what had happened to them. But they all came back slightly different. So their hair had changed color, their eyes had changed color, and they each had a hook-shaped scar at the base of their throats that they couldn't remember getting. And then the story kind of begins 10 years later, and the youngest sister, Iris, is our protagonist. She's just trying to like finish high school, and she's living in the shadow of her two older sisters, who are these kind of glamorous, worldly, famous women. And then the eldest sister, Gray, goes missing for a second time. And the other two sisters have to team up to figure out what happened to them when they were children so that they can track her down and save her.
And it is absolutely excellent. I think probably everyone could tell based on the three pitches, magic is a key theme, but it always comes at a price. So I thought it'd be kind of interesting to kick the conversation off by talking about why, what is the instinct to always do that? Why does nobody just get magic? Why does magic always come at a price? And when you're writing and thinking about it, what kind of inspirations do you draw on to like kind of set up your magical cost benefit? And we, talking about these existing books, and obviously, Victoria, I know magic is a big theme in the Shades of Power series as well, so you can draw on that. I'll allow it. You don't just have to talk about Gallant. So yeah, discuss. Krystal, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think this is a really great question, because setting the rules and boundaries for magic are almost like the most important thing to do out the gate. If you want an interesting magic system, you need to have strict rules, and you need to have controls over how powerful people can be as well. I often think the least interesting superhero is Superman, because he just never fails and he's so powerful. And I was never super compelled by him as a child. I was always more interested in the superheroes who were more morally gray and who were, had more restraints around their power, I suppose. So for me, that's kind of the place I start when I'm thinking about magic, is like, what can't it do? And then you kind of work back from there. And that's kind of what I was thinking with House of Hollow as well, is I wanted the magic to feel like it existed in the shadows of our world. It was almost like the supernatural brushing up very gently against our world. And then that became the constraint. I didn't want it to feel like it was big and brash and overflowing. It was very subtle. And it was almost like this thing that existed. And if you only looked at it for a second, then maybe you would miss it. And so for me, that's where I started. And I just had to thread through like that.
I love you saying that about if you look at it only for a second, because Victoria, you literally in Gallant, that's the whole thing with kind of the ghouls at the beginning, when she's, it's a small spoiler, but when Olivia can see ghouls, and but only kind of looking at them sideways. I forget what, use a gorgeous metaphor. I think maybe it's a silverfish metaphor, but it's so exactly how I would, if, magic was existing in the real world, I would imagine it. So do you, Victoria, kind of feel similarly about, when you're creating your magical rules?
Yeah, I almost used the Superman example again. But I would say that like the Superman is only interesting because of kryptonite, right? Like he has one cost thing, but it doesn't actually reflect his own cost. Whereas I remember when I was watching The Flash, and I think they had him where like Barry Allen kept fainting because it basically was like using up too much of his energy. And that's so much more interesting. And I think it's in part because, when we write fantasy, every step into the strange that we take is a step away from reality, and it's a step we're asking readers to take. And I think we do our best work when we're able to tether fantasy to reality in a way that helps us as like humans conceive of it. And I think in our own life, everything has cost. And so I think magic is kind of deeply uninteresting unto itself when it has no cost. But I also think that, like, for instance, in Shades of Magic is one of my only times where I've made the magic itself not have a cost, because the magic is kind of the god. But the thing is that magic doesn't work without vessels, and the vessels are the cost, right? Like magic in itself is pure and potentially limitless, but when we take it into ourselves is when we give it cost, is when we realize that like we're the fragile element there. So I think either magic has to be the fragile element, fantasy has to have the boundary, or it has to illuminate a boundary within us, if that makes sense. So I do think it's like illuminating our mortality, illuminating our limits, illuminating our like psychic limits as well. Like how dark will it make us? Where will it take us? How far are we willing to follow it? But yeah, I do think that power should always have some form of blowback. I'll never forget like Holly Black's Curse Worker series. My favorite element of that was the blowback of anything that they did.
Oh, I love that series so much. But she was just in London recently, and I saw her event, and I was like, love that series so much. And then Melissa, coming to our book of the evening, and there is a lot of cost in magic, and as you were saying, costs that has massive repercussions. So yeah, what are kind of your thoughts on magic but at a cost, and especially when you were writing this book, kind of what influenced that?
So in this book specifically, I kind of love the idea of telling a story, the like nested story of a witchy girl in the 90s, and giving her like that classic fun paranormal arc, of course, with like disastrous endings. but then teasing it out as kind of like the backstory / like feed of something that happens to her daughter 25 years later. So it's like that idea of magic that like reverberates through time, and like the legacy of something that happens and how that can affect you, and how who your parents are kind of color who you are. But another thing that I love what Krystal said about that idea of magic kind of just brushing up against our world. And I think that's why I love portal fantasy so much, because portal fantasies are like, by definition, they're rooted in like a world of mundanity and consequence. And then you get to like step through the door into something different, but you always take yourself through that door, and you take whatever happens to you back through it. So I kind of love those stories that step through liminal spaces and like step in and out of the mundane and the magical. And I think this does it in less of a literal way than portal fantasy, but it still has that kind of like stepping in and out of the magical.
And Hazelwood, of course, is very much a very much a portal fantasy, and kind of going into that world. It's interesting, both of you saying kind of about how it brushes up against you, because we're all, I think everyone living in the real world, you're always a little bit hoping for that. You're like, maybe if I do step through this doorway, it'll be a little bit magical. Although I wouldn't want to go into any of your worlds. I'm sorry, they're all too scary. No, thank you. Absolutely not. I think that's such an interesting concept about magic, but at the price, and how you're gonna incorporate that. And I love that, Melissa, how you have it kind of reverberating through, and then like again those consequences, like doing some, for the mom, for Dana, it's like this is affecting her children for later on. I also want to touch on, and this is related to magic at a price, magic and madness together, because this is something that all of you have written about, and I think it's really interesting and intriguing. And I think kind of throughout history, there's always been like, oh, is this person magical, or are they losing their mind? Who could tell? And I think that that's something that you all do write about and explore. Victoria in Gallant, I don't know spoilers, but Olivia's mom has descended kind of, it appears, into madness from her brushes kind of up against something otherworldly. What do you guys think about that link between using magic or believing in magic and then madness in it? In your fiction?
I kind of feel like it's tied a little bit to the idea of the outsider, right? Because like when we have insiders, they're usually acclimated. They're usually able to handle the kind of like the element, the magic, whatever form it is. But kind of going hand in hand, Melissa, with portal fantasy is this idea that like we have an outsider. We have someone who has entered into a space in which they do not understand the rules. And so the consequence and the madness, like a lot of that comes with them being out of their depth. Like that's almost trial by fire of a lot of these magical systems, of not understanding the magnitude of the magic you're encountering as the mundane individual, as like that's the like cracks appear at the connection point of the magic and the mundane.
And I don't want to say too many spoilers about our Crooked Hearts, but Melissa, I do feel like there's moments specifically in Dana's world where some of the girls start, it's almost like it's upset. It's like, it feels like it's like an interest in magic leads to an obsession, then leads to madness. Kind of seems to be a theme that I think we kind of return to again and again.
I think in the 90s thread of the book, there's a trio of witches, and I don't think this is too spoilery to say that for 2 of the 3 girls, magic comes naturally, and it's like an extension of what they can already do, and it's like it can be like this joyful kind of organic thing for them. And then the third witch, by kind of being outside of that circle of like what's natural to her, it drives, it's like an ambition and an obsession, and that kind of like drives her deeper and into deeper and darker places into magic. And I think obsession can look like madness, right? And like wanting something too much and being denied something that means that much to you, and seeing someone else get it easily, that can look like madness too, when it's like hunger.
There's such a specific scene in the book that I'm imagining that you capture that absolutely perfectly. And like you say, that thing of like the want and the desire, and being like, why is this person getting it when I'm willing to do literally anything? And then Krystal, kind of touching on House of Hollow and madness, I think what it is for for Iris, she doesn't realize that she has this kind of potentially link to the uncanny and the magical, and that is, she starts to worry that she's going mad. And I think that's kind of where that ties in. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's an element of power in there as well, and like magic as a symbol for unrestrained power, or like a lust for power. And if you have too much power, then you descend into madness. And for Iris as well, it's not just about that. I mean, that's more of a Gray, her older sister, who has more links with the supernatural and kind of, you could say, like more of a descent into madness because of it. But for Iris, it's also linked with identity too, and discovering yourself, or like discovering the darker parts of your own psyche, perhaps can sometimes feel like discovering magic or a descent into madness. They're kind of like these parallels, and I think that's what fantasy does really well, is kind of walk that line. And I think the best kinds of magic, or the kinds of magic that I most enjoy reading about, are the kinds where you can't really tell if it's magic that's existing in the world, or if maybe your character is kind of an unreliable narrator who's descending into madness. So I think they are inherently linked in that way, and those are my favorite kinds of stories to read.
And if you think about kind of like in so much fiction, and historically, like magic and hysteria have been linked so much. I remember being a 13-year-old girl and doing lights of feather stiff as a board. Like you could see, and then like all sorts of kind of things that where you're right on the edge of that kind of like hysteria and excitement, and wanting to kind of psych yourself up for it. Something I think is also really interesting that all of you do specifically in these most recent works is magic and mystery, and someone protecting someone from not knowing about their magical legacy. Whether it is, in Gallant, Olivia has these letters from her mother, that don't spell anything out, but they're saying, do not go to Gallant, do not go to Gallant. She's obviously trying to protect her, and then in Our Crooked Hearts, like, there's, our main character doesn't know anything about what her mom has done and how that will impacted her. And that's kind of a very big key thing that you explore throughout. And then in House of Hollow, Iris also doesn't know what her heritage is. And, obviously as a writer, from a plot purpose, that's quite useful because the reader is discovering things as the character is. But, what is, magic is already interesting, but what do you think makes it extra interesting by making it a mystery for your kind of main character? Melissa, I'd love to kind of start with you with that, because that's such a key part of Dana trying to protect. I don't think that's much a spoiler to say Dana trying to protect her daughter from
not at all
magical lineages.
Well, the part of it that was so fun for me was that I have this teenage girl, and she's kind of lived this life where she's been aware of her mother as a sort of a distant figure, and she's kind of held that idea of her at arm's length because it makes her sad. And then she's sort of jolted into having to suddenly look at it more closely. And then what I was able to have a lot of fun with was like drawing her through with these little, extremely, increasingly strange breadcrumbs that are kind of all coalescing around this mystery. So that was for me just like a pleasure as a storyteller to kind of get to tell a story in these little mysterious pieces that way. And then the like 90s half of the story, like the actual bit of it where we're getting like the meat of what happened. That, speaking of withholding, so I wanted to give Dana her full story because she is a mother, as am I, and she does something to her daughter that is a betrayal. And it's something that I was kind of writing into this book. And when I did so, I realized that I needed to give Dana, like that was part of my decision to start telling the story as two stories, because you really need to see everything she goes through and walk through it with her to understand why she withholds and why she does what she does. So I hope that you will find it to be like a natural secret, like something that you could see a mother doing what she does. But I needed to give her half the book to kind of make her case.
Kind of, discover it. And then Victoria, what about you? Kind of what, with Gallant, like again, Olivia just has these kind of clues and hints. Melissa, you said breadcrumbs. I think Olivia's got a similar thing.
Literally everyone's trying to keep stories from Olivia, because she then gets to Gallant, meets Matthew, her cousin, who then also insists on keeping everything from her. And I think it's that line of like, knowledge is power, ignorance is bliss. And I think that there's also, when we talk about the dark side of magic, or the potential obsession, or the idea of almost like culpability by knowledge, like if once you know, you can't unknow a thing. And so I think that's such a difficult thing, especially for a teenage protagonist, because you're at the age where you're like, but I can decide for myself, and I have to decide for myself. And at what point can we take that agency, right? And so I think that I like playing with it. Obviously, it's fun as a plot device, but it, one is an intentional mystery. Like Matthew is intentionally keeping something from Olivia. Olivia's mother is speaking in the language that she has, in the way that she has. Like the journal was never actually supposed to be for Olivia. the journal was something else. It was an artifact, right? That was.
Oh, I just got chills. Like, I was like, oh, the journal's not meant for her. Ah.
Yeah, so it's not an intentional mystery on the mother's point, but it's almost a point of proof of why Olivia shouldn't know more because of what's happened to her mother. And so I think it's that sense of like when we care about people or when we are involved in something that's harmful or dangerous, we do have a desire to exclude or protect other people from it. But at what point is like, it has to be your choice. And so for Olivia, it doesn't, like, it's an infuriating thing. It only eggs her on in terms of the curiosity of her needing to understand more, because like what they're trying to hide from her is in part like her own identity.
Yeah, her own history. And then Krystal, like Iris doesn't know a lot about, she had this time where she went missing. She doesn't remember it. Maybe her siblings do.
For me, honestly, it's pure wish fulfillment, because I really hope that magic exists and someone has just been hiding it from me my entire life. Like, I was the kid who was convinced that magic was real and I just had to find it. And so I would, when I was walking through the forest, I would jump into the toadstool ring and hope that the fairies would capture me. Or I would, run to the dark end of the library and hope to find ghosts there and things like that. And I've really been my whole life looking for the magic and hoping maybe that some family member or someone is just trying to protect me and they're keeping it from me. So this, truly, Iris is living my dream. Magic is real and someone has just been hiding it from her.
You went missing when you were a child. You don't remember anything. It was probably a traumatic. You're like, I want that. I want that for myself.
She's living my dream.
I do feel like there's like a massive commonality in everything that all of us write, though, right? Which is this like the same reason I was always more drawn to C.S. Lewis than Tolkien, is like one promises you a world through a door that you just have to find.
Yes.
Right. And I think there's like some intoxicating element. I was also that kid, Krystal, and largely that adult who was just looking for cracks in the world. And I feel like what we all write are kind of cracks in the world.
Absolutely. I think that is across all three of our books. Everything that we write is about the crack in the world.
And I think you would say, writing is its own kind of magic, storytelling and bringing people along. Will writing send you on a descent into madness? Who can tell? But I do think all of your works are truly magical. They're the kind of sticky books that just, like stick to you and you, in your mind and in your heart and you like in your bones. Like, so even you just mentioning that before, like gave me chills. Like, and I think that it is a skill that comes from the storytelling, but also kind of word choice. And we'll come to like the nerdy crafty bit in a little bit because I'm excited to geek out about that. But something I've been really interesting about all of your works is kind of the influence of fairy tale. And I think Melissa, you definitely leaned into this more in Hazelwood. I still feel like in our Crooked Hearts, there's kind of an influence of fairy tale. And again, that concept of and for me, it was interesting, Victoria, I've read all of your books, but I feel like Gallant felt the most fairy tale-esque in kind of its setup. How much would you three say that you are influenced by kind of fairy tale archetypes? Maybe consciously or subconsciously? Melissa, I'm going to go to you.
I think for Crooked Hearts, it's definitely, we use the word witchcraft because it's like such an easy kind of umbrella for what I'm doing in the book. But in the actual book, the word witch shows up maybe once or twice. I more often use like the word worker, or practitioner, or occultist, because I wanted to kind of, witch is maybe an umbrella term for all of the different ways that people work magic, all the different ways people bend the world to their will. And I think this book has just as much of my allegiance to fairy tales as it does my allegiance to witches. And there's like at least one character who's like a straight up homage to, Firuza Balk. Like you'll know her when you see her. Like there's definitely like the crafty character, and there's that vibe in the 90s section, because how can you avoid it when you're talking about witches in the 90s? But there's the mother-daughter thing, and there's like the secrets, and there's like the object magic, and there's a straight up reference to an invented fairy tale that I created, for the story.
You are very good at that. You are very good at making up fairy tales.
Thank you. I'm telling a lot to my child right now, and they're not allowed to be spooky. So I have to save all of my spookiness for grownups who don't know me, and not for the children who do. So it's. I just love the tropes of it, and I love the tactility of fairy tales. I just can't quite get over that idea of finding the object, and like finding the key that you know means you're going to like find the door. That's something I love in fairy tales. Every kind of magical object you find is a question that will be answered. So I can't stop loving that kind of story.
Even in the way you talk about writing, you're saying breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs are very much like a fairy tale, esque trope. Victoria, what about you? Kind of what, like I said, Gallant for me feels like in terms of your recent work, the most kind of fairy tale-esque.
I love the structure of a fairy tale. I always think of a fairy tale as a circle that almost ends in the same place, but doesn't. And so like, I do love like simply the structure. I think that fairy tales feel small in a very intimate way, like not small in an insignificant way, but like they feel nested. They feel very close. They've meant to be told in a whisper. So I love a structure. Like we can talk about craft later, but like, because I write my endings first, like I know how to make a perfect circle from where I start to where I end. And I'm always kind of looking to see if I can do that in a fairy tale. But I also think that the weirder my story is, the more I really love being able to use archetypes as almost waypoints for the reader so that they have something to hook onto in their mind. So like, as weird as the story gets, okay, well, you grew up knowing never to go through the locked door, the house in the woods, all these things. So if I can create these kind of mental shortcuts, mental shorthands for a reader, it allows me to be weirder because I know that I've given them like a place of proximity, if that makes sense. And I think fairy tales help with us creating like those little archetypal beats where we say, okay, I recognize this. I understand this land.
That's such an interesting and such a good point about how, yeah, as a reader, you are like, no, don't go through the locked door. No, don't follow, go where the witch is. Don't follow the breadcrumbs. That's really interesting idea of kind of using that to kind of, ground your reader in a way. There was something about Gallant when I first started reading it that it felt so fresh, but so familiar in the same way, if that makes sense. Like I was like, oh, I'm in a school, and I think you really nailed that. And then Krystal, with House of Hollow, I feel like, you play a lot with the concept of three, which again is quite a fairy, you have three sisters. And again, that idea of kind of portal fantasy, which is inherently kind of in fairy tales. So how much influence do you think you drew from fairy tales for these?
Yeah, it was something I was thinking about a lot because I really wanted this book to feel like, it was a lost Grimm Brothers fairy tale. Like maybe it could have been just torn out of the back of the book and no one had read it before. And then we rediscovered it in the 21st century. Like it's three children falling through a door and coming back. And then there's this like quite grim, shocking twist at the end that feels very fairy tale-esque. And I'm almost shocked that my publisher let me get away with it, to be honest. And so I was thinking about fairy tale a lot. And I like looking back to the stories that really influenced me when I was growing up and continue to influence me now. I think Little Red Riding Hood is like my favorite fairy tale. And I am still trying to recreate the sensation of reading that and having that be told to me. Like, I love writing about forests and like these deep, dark woods and like the deception of characters who are pretending to be something that they're not, and the terror and the threat that comes along with that. I think that story in particular still resonates with me and is still something I'm trying to capture in my work as I continue to write.
I can very much see the influence of Red Riding Hood in House of Hollow. Absolutely. And I think there's something about like forests that are, deeply dark. And, Melissa, you especially do that in Hazelwood. There's a lot of, so much of it takes place in a in the Hazelwood, in a magical, creepy, super cool forest. I also wanted to talk a little bit about ghosts, which play a pretty significant part. And I don't think this is too spoilery to say, but in Our Crooked Hearts, I won't say which storyline, but some characters become quite obsessed with calling forth someone who has passed. And what is it? And then in Victoria, in your book, there's a lot of ghosts in terms of, like I was saying, Olivia can kind of see them. What is that line of ghosts and magic and kind of that blend? And why as a writer, are you drawn to that? Why do you think readers are drawn to the concept of ghosts? So yeah, when you were writing Our Crooked Hearts, did you know that you were going to kind of put in a prominent potential ghost character?
So I started with a character sitting down to tell her story to some other characters, and I decided to set that story in a library. And it's like this crooked, strange library that, as I wrote, became a house where an occultist once lived. So it was an occultist's crooked, bizarre house that turned into a library that, of course, was haunted. But I wanted to make it less straightforward than just a haunted library, although that is enough for me. That I love haunted libraries, don't get me wrong. I wanted to play with that idea of the library as kind of a liminal space. So it's like not quite a ghost, not quite a haunting. And I'll leave it at that.
That's where we're at. Fair enough. Fair enough. Victoria, what about you? Kind of where did ghosts come in with Gallon?
Well, it's one of the very first images I had for the book was Olivia standing in this garden shed, and she is trying to think about why no one else ever comes in this garden shed because it's like one of the only refuges. And then she's like, it's probably the dead thing in the corner. And then she talks about being able to see this thing out of the corner of her eye that disappears as soon as she looks at it. But something I wanted to explore with the ghosts, or the ghouls as they're called in Gallant, is like that they're never all there. And I do feel like it's that sense of being haunted. I was never like really convinced in ghosts as like manifesting head to toe, but I just loved this idea of almost like tiny little relics, like tiny little pieces that had just been kind of shot through with light. And this almost like insubstantial thing that you start to think of as just set dressing, right? Oh, it's just proof that Olivia is creepy. It's just proof that Olivia is like a little bit on the line between life and death. But obviously, the ghouls become like extraordinarily important to the plot. So they weren't when I first invented them. They were just this sign that Olivia was in some way standing on a line between life and death, like that she could see something others couldn't. But I'm always really interested in ghosts as like I'm now starting to explore it in Shades of Magic, the idea of like, does London believe in ghosts because they have like a different mental state? But like the idea of being haunted, the idea of the past dragging in our wake, either as information or as like company. Like I think I find comfort in it, the idea that like we linger, but also like it's both a comfort and a horror in Gallant, depending on the perspective of it. There are moments when that the presence of ghouls is the most comforting thing in Olivia's life, and there's moments where of course it's terrifying.
I love that concept in fiction of the lingering if you have unfinished business. And I think that's something in fiction, and I think that's something cultures around the world believe. And I'm just endlessly fascinated in that idea that, you will linger, but, and is it a blessing or a curse? And that's a whole other panel discussing that. And then Krystal, there's not loads of ghosts at House and Hollow, but because I know that you do like ghosts. So Krystal is my horror film Sherpa. She makes me watch loads and loads of horror films with her. So I know, that you are interested in ghosts. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I am interested in ghosts, but it's also the one thing in horror that like truly scares me, I think. So I've never written about ghosts, and I have no interest in exploring it myself as a writer because I genuinely am so scared by it. Like I'm convinced there's a ghost in my bathroom at the moment. And I had to have a chat to it the other day. I was like, whatever you're doing is scaring me, so please stop it. And now all the weird stuff that goes on in my bathroom has stopped. So that's nice. But yeah, I love watching horror movies. I love ghost stories. But as a creator, I have never touched it. And I'm not sure that I will because it creeps me out too much.
That's so interesting. Because again, I do know that you love horror, but I like you're like, nope, don't even want to go anywhere that makes
think about that for too long.
But it's such a weird stance, right? Because like the only reason that I write horror is because I'm so scared of it. But when I'm writing it, it can't scare me because I'm controlling the like jump scares, I'm controlling the elements. So it's like becomes a known because so much of horror and ghost stories rely on what you can't see. Yeah. And like the like intimacy of it, like whereas like I don't watch ghost movies, I don't watch horror stories, but I write them because to me that's not scary then because it's intimate.
Interesting. Maybe I need to write a ghost story to kind of deal with my fear of ghosts.
Maybe. Do you worry that if you write about ghosts, you'll draw their attention to you?
Yes.
I
think like you're just inviting a haunting if you write about ghosts. It's going to happen. Even if you're just going to start seeing things and noticing things if you put your mind to it.
You already have a haunting.
You already have a haunting. I lived in a haunted house before I ever wrote about ghosts. And since writing about ghosts, I have not lived in a haunted house. So I'm not saying there's a correlation there, but I'm just saying that the ghosts, I think you're already tuned to the weird based on what you write. Like you're kind of already paying attention, like what my friend would call like the art of noticing. So I feel like you're already noticing those things, but like I think the ghosts are either there already or they're not.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Well,
see.
it's like in Gallant, like, you know, Victoria, how you have, you know, if you look at them straight on, and you notice them, they scatter, where it's like that bit where you're like, are you there? Are you there? Where they're really going to be right there. So no, I agree. I think you're doing too much of the, are you there? Victoria and Melissa, I'd love to know if there's anything that scares you so much you wouldn't write about it.
Ooh. I think in Crooked Hearts, I wrote about one of my biggest fears. I wrote it during the pandemic, and in it is the idea of failing as a parent. And like, that doesn't sound very fun, but I think the anxiety is in there. As far as like the things that scare me in the supernatural, I'm such a scaredy cat, and I'm just like,
Really?
like I when I read a scary, even a little bit scary book, I'll have like tears freely flowing down my face with like fear.
No way.
But when I write something and people find it scary, I remember when the Hazelwood came out, I thought it was kind of like a fairy tale romp, and then people found it scary.
Happened 3 times.
And I was kind of delighted because I didn't, it was sort of like an unintentional creep into horror. And then Crooked Hearts is like a more intentional, deeper creep into horror, I would say. And maybe one day I'll go all the way and just write a horror novel. Not yet. Grady Hendrix, there we go. His stories are so scary because there's body horror in them. That's what I can't do, body horror.
Oh, Krystal, yeah.
There's nothing that scares me so much I won't write about it. The more something scares me, the more likely I am to write it. Because again, I feel like it loses power over me when I write about it. Like I have such a huge fear of being buried alive. Like it's just my biggest fear. And I wrote it in Gathering of Shadows, Lila Bard is buried alive. And like that scene was so, I would get a panic attack while I was writing it. Like it was so awful to write. But then like, again, like not when something scares me, I want to write about it because then I'm in the driver's seat of it. Whereas like if I'm not writing about it, then it still has some kind of power over me. Whereas like I was only able to start watching horror films when I stopped looking away when the score wanted me to. Like if you actually watch horror films the way Olivia looks at ghouls in Gallant, like head on, they're not scary because like all the cues in the film are teaching you when to like jump or when to look away. But if you just hold eye contact with them, they're not scary. And I feel like for me, that's the act of writing things that scare me is like, I'm sitting with it. Like, I'm just like, oh, well, I'm not looking away.
So I can understand. That's so interesting. I mean, like I said, I watch loads of horror movies with Krystal, usually with my head like fully covered.
Yeah.
I'm a big, and I think books can be, obviously film has all of the stuff, and I'd be so interested to talk about adaptations with all of you, but film has the benefit of having things like a musical score, like making the shadows go, but I don't think anything scary you as much as your own imagination. Of course, you have the benefit of being able to skip over pages and stuff, but I think books are definitely have more power for fear, I think, than films. Like you say, you can kind of, address it straight on. I'm just letting people know for the Q&A, I'm probably going to come to questions for everyone in about 5 minutes. So if you have questions, pop them in the Q&A box. But I am just like, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much. I want to talk about horror and ghosts and like so many things. But I've been teasing saying we were going to talk a little bit about craft and writing. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are joined us this evening who are writers and who are interested in how you all write. So kind of kick us off about format. I'd love, Melissa, you touched on it briefly, kind of why you chose to have 2 different, time frames. How did you write them? Did you write one and then write the other one? Did you write when I say linearly, I mean, did you write the book kind of as it starts? Go on. How did you blend these 2 very linked but quite distinctive storylines?
So I had a lot of false starts with this book. I wanted to write a suburban fantasy, but I wasn't sure what the engine of the magic would be yet. And by suburban fantasy, I mean something that feels kind of like as crackly and specific as urban fantasy, but like with that Lynchian, creepy suburban setting. But as I worked on it, I kept on trying different kinds of magic. I was trying it's like a multiverse version of this. There was like portals, obviously, and nothing was quite working. And then when it finally clicked into place for me that it was like this mother-daughter story, and ultimately that half of it was going to take place in the city 25 years ago, it was such a natural fit that it would be witchcraft, because it just or like craft magic for a story of a mother and a daughter that kind of like intuitive magic felt like such a fit. And it just came out of the kind of magic I wanted to explore, and also this exciting opportunity I saw to get to write half of it in Chicago of the 90s, which I just could not say no to. But yeah, it came up about organically in the writing. And then the way that I wrote it was I wrote, and initially Dana, the 90s thread, her story, I was kind of writing it to myself. It was kind of like backstory notes. And then when it was like 40,000 words long, I recognized that it was actually meant to be part of the book. So I wrote their stories in tandem. I just kind of switched between them when I would get tired of writing one or when I would get stuck. I generally like the other one. I could find a way through. Like my block about one would have been taken down. And then when I had these two kind of threads, I wove them together. And that was a lot of trial and error and a lot of cutting. There's like a novel's worth of Chicago stuff that I had to cut for the greater good. So that was dicey, but it really fit, and it made me ultimately feel like that idea of like the writer's back brain, like the kind of the bubbling like thoughts that you have at the back of your head while you're working that you're not aware of. I think that kind of informed the way it kind of ultimately snapped together, I think, in a good way.
It does. It's so satisfying. I love that you were saying kind of the suburban supernatural. And there's a bit, and again, this is very happens at the beginning, where you've got our character and she's driving, and there's all of a sudden like a naked woman in the road unexpectedly, and it's just like so visceral. You can imagine what that would be like on this like dark, quiet street, and you're like, something is. And at first she's like, oh my gosh, something wrong. And she gets out and she's like, oh no, something is wrong, but like not wrong for why you think there's a random woman running, and then it just gets that like. It's something I want to touch on as well is how you all three of you do the uncanny so well. That bit where you're like, all of your hair stands up. So I love that. I think it was really interesting how you set half of it, you split how it was set.
Well, I love the idea, speaking of like that sense where you have a character who's like, something's wrong and I know what it is. And then they have like a whole new context and vocabulary is introduced to them. And they have like a deepening, bottoming out understanding of how wrong something is in ways they couldn't even have imagined. I love that kind of scene.
Well, that is to be terrifying. Being like, let me help you. And then being like, oh, something's weird. I should have stayed in the car. It's a really interesting concept. And then Victoria, I didn't realize that you start at the end. And I have done events with you. I've seen you do events. I don't know how I missed this incredible fact. So you must be a plotter then if you start at the end.
I am. I like start at the end, meaning it's not the first thing that I write, but it's the thing that I need to know before I start writing the book. Like I need to know exactly how it ends. For me, it's like the taste left in your mouth, but it's also the thing I'm writing to. If you look at like the last page of Gallant, if you haven't read it, then you should read it and then look at the last page of Gallant. Don't look at the last page first. But like every motif, every idea, every element that is the story is working toward that last page landing. So that, yeah, I write completely out of order. I plot completely in order, and then I write completely out of order. And I can't start without the end. And then structurally, Gallant, I try to set a structural challenge with each book because I'm just a nerd, but structurally, Gallant brought in a completely new set because in addition to having like the master of the house voice, which is this black page that comes at the beginning of every section, which that's fairly common for me to have like an interstitial voice in the book. I also have illustrations and I have journals. So there's like this found object element. And the thing about the illustrations and the journals is that they're not ornamental. Like I went to my publisher and I was like, hey, I would like to do this book with illustrations and I need to know if it's possible before I start writing the book because it's completely an element of plot. And if it's not possible, then I need to like rethink everything. So for me, like it was a structural element of the story. So that's one of the reasons I plot is because I really like to have like an idea of what the entire system looks like. And then I start working on it. And then I'm allowed to like pull pieces out of order because I know where they're going to go back in the system. So I think it also depends on the kind of story you're writing. Gallant is a mystery. And like this found object is integral to the mystery. It's harder to like free form a mystery than it is like a fantasy novel or something that's a little bit more exploratory. So for something like Gallant, because it's a nuclear, it's like very small, it's very intimate, it needs to end in a very specific way. I very like strictly plan the entire thing.
I love that you said that you don't write linearly. So you'll know where you're going and you'll have it plotted out. And then you just like wake up and be like, I'm in the mood to write this scene. Like how does that work?
I mean, I did that for Addie LaRue, which is basically 300 scenes. I like had the entire map of 300 scenes, and they were, because it's a character-driven novel, not a plot-driven novel. That way I knew I needed to write every day, but that way I was able to wake up and be like, what am I psychically capable of writing today? Like, can I write the worst night of Henry's life? Or do I need to write this romance scene from New Orleans? Or can I write the French Revolution? Like, I needed to have that. Gallant, I said all of that, and then I realized that Gallant, which is my 21st novel, is the very first one that I actually wrote entirely in order. So even though I planned it, I then went and I actually wrote it in order, and it became like something that I'll probably never do again, but it was nice to get to do that. But no, I plan every beat pretty closely, and then it becomes execution. And like, people think that takes the joy out of it, but for me, the joy is in the discovery of the plan. The execution is like satisfaction for me. That's not like, I'm discovering little things along the way of writing, but like the pre-writing, the planning of the whole book, kind of what's for someone else would be a skeleton. That to me is like, that's my beautiful brainstorming place.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I feel like, yeah, the thinking about it is always a joyful part, but all three of you are so skilled with language, and on a, you know, pure sentence level, it's such a joy to read all of your works, and you can just tell when you're kind of like really like just nailing these sentences. And I think that's interesting. Krystal, for you, do you write linearly, or do you outline, or you bounce around? What?
I'm kind of somewhere between a plotter and a pantser, I suppose. So what interests me in a story is usually like 4 or 5 big beats that I know are going to happen. And that is kind of what I begin with at the beginning of a story. And I'll write fairly linearly from the beginning to the end, kind of skipping over things that I don't know and getting to those 4 or 5 things that I know have to happen. So I'll know the beginning, I'll know the like inciting incident, I know roughly where I'm going and roughly where I want it to end. But I don't know, I can't envision an entire story from beginning to end until I'm there writing it. And I will discover so much as I'm kind of in the weeds, like wading my way through the swamp, and things will come out of the fog. And I really wish that I was more of a plotter, and that I could like do one scene after another in my head and then write it. But you just kind of make peace with your process after a while, I suppose. And this is how I get books written. I have a rough idea at the beginning, and then I just, wade in and see what I find.
It is grass is greener though, because I would love to be that way. Like, that sounds joyful to me. And my anxiety is like, no.
I think it's because I write solo, but I also co-write. So I wrote Revelry by myself. It took me 5 years. It's only 50,000 words. And I co-wrote Twin Crowns. And when you're co-writing, you have to have an outline, because you have to know what the other person is doing. And it took way less time. So I think, but I agree. I think that you do. So I've seen the joy in both, you know, and the not joy in both too. But I think it's, like you say, like having those. And I think a lot of writers, you have those scenes that you know you want to write, and they're like the joyful ones that you're like, these are my treats. These are the ones that I can see, like, why I've been wanting to write this book is to like write these scenes. And we do have quite a few Q&A, but right before I come to those, I do want to ask you, and I know I've kind of touched already on how, you know, in awe I am of all three of you, kind of on a sentence level and like language. And you know, we've been talking about plotting, and story itself is obviously hugely important, but I do think on a sentence level, you guys all really set the bar. When does that happen in the process? You know, do you write beautiful sentences from the get-go? Does that come when you're editing? Melissa, what do you think?
Oh gosh. Someone asked me this question when I was touring with my first book. And I was like, I think I just kind of wrote it. And then I was like, I genuinely believed myself to have written my first book. And then I published it. That was how I remembered it in my head. And then when I wrote my second book, I remembered. It was like all of these buried memories came up, and you do a lot of editing, and like, you know, maybe a few sentences survive as they were first put down, but it's like edit after edit after edit. And I'd literally forgotten. And I really do liken it to childbirth. Like, you don't remember how hard it is. Hopefully you guys find it a little bit hard. I don't know, maybe I'm alone, but it is a lot of editing. And I forget every time. And I always say that I'm going to journal, and like, this today was a hard writing day. Here's why. And I never do that, because maybe it's best to mostly forget. So I don't even have specifics for you. I just know that it's hard, and I edit a lot.
What about you, Krystal? So spoiler, I read a lot of Krystal's early drafts. Krystal writes really beautiful first drafts. She's that kind of person. No, it's unfair.
I'm very slow. I'm a slow drafter, and I am envious of people who can just like are not afraid to be like wrong and rough in that first draft and will just get it out and then they go back later on. And I like to luxuriate and take my time, and like it means some days, I'll only write like 500 words because I will sit with those 500 words and think about like, what are all the different ways I could say this thing that I'm trying to say? How can I use language in an interesting way that, makes people see what I'm writing in a way where they won't just kind of brush over a cliche. And so I love writing like that, but it does make me slow. And that's kind of where it happens in the process for me. And then of course, like in the editing as well, you sit with it even longer and you add more and you kind of just add these layers to the luxuriousness of the writing.
I know we're all fans of Laini Taylor, and I think she really also is a master at like beautiful sentence level. Just like you're like, oh, it's just like adding so much. And then Victoria, what about you? There's so many lines. When I'm reading your books, that I just want to be like, as a reader and as a writer, like highlighting. And are you like, like Krystal was saying, did you have to sit with it and it takes you longer to get out, or do you go back, make the lines beautiful at a later stage?
Both, all of the above. I wish I could be a fast drafter and just get the bones down. And I have taught whole courses on like, just get the bones down. The makeup goes last. And this is because like I've had to delete entire books before. Like the most painful thing about deleting the book was the fact that I loved the sentences. But like, that's one of the reasons that I plot so much now, is because I need to understand that I have structural stability so that I can linger on the words, because I'm somebody who can't move on unless I'm happy with at least most of the words I've used. I need to know that there are like beautiful moments. Not every line has to be perfect. And I'm like revising an 800-page novel right now, so I'm sure there will be lots of things that are just like scrapped, but I have to be confident in what I have in order to keep going. I start like losing hope in like moving forward if I'm not in love with what has come behind. So I need to have at least a few real gems. My favorite one are I will stumble on the things that I know will become the quotable pieces. Like when I write one of them, I get very excited because
like, this will be not tote bag.
I'm like, I can see it. I know that this is gonna be like the Goodreads highlight, But I would say probably half of them come in the first draft and the other half like as I'm polishing. But I have to have stuff that excites me, or I just don't want to keep writing.
Yeah, I'm so I feel the same loss of hope. Yeah, you have to like feel that shiver, and it's not there if the words are all wrong.
Exactly. It's so interesting too, because I think it's different if you're writing first person or third person. That's like a whole little like craft chat about, because I think if you're, fully voice driven, I'd imagine that when the editing, because you're focusing more on the voice versus the like the beautiful words. I don't know, lots of different discussions.
I also think that I just was going to say House of Hollow and Gallant, and I mean, to be honest, like all of Melissa's books have a sense of atmosphere. Like a lot of what we've been talking about, proximity and magic, also boils down to atmosphere, and like atmosphere and voice and language are so important to like creating the spell, that I think it's one of those things that like these books kind of almost require that as like the veil to make you walk through.
So true. No, I definitely anyone watching, obviously you've joined because you are a fan of one of these authors, but yeah, masterclass in terms of on a language level, but also kind of story wise. I'm a real Melissa. My mind was blown when I read Tales from the Hinterland. So if you haven't read Hazelwood, there's reference to a book, and then Melissa wrote the book, which I love it. So meta, a book of fairy tales, and it's so literally magical. I love it so much. Yeah, I've like reread it so many times. It's such again, like the language is so beautiful. And I think there's something really like because fairy tales can't really be voice driven. There's so much more atmosphere and so much, I don't know, very skillful. But we do have so many questions. I could just keep on getting excited and fangirling, but I want to make sure that other people have the opportunity to fangirl as well. So Kara has asked, once you finish your first draft and you look over it for the first time, do you read through making notes, or do you read it in full and then think about it? That's an interesting, quite a craft related question.
I read through making notes. That's like related to my inability to keep going if I'm unhappy. So I'll think like, I'm going to read this whole draft in 2 days. So it's fresh in my mind, and it always takes me like 5. And I will try to limit myself to line edits, and then like in all caps, I'll write like big picture notes that I want to go back to. And also like have 5 other random drafts with notes I'm keeping. But it's a very active process when I'm
Is
reading.
that before you like share it with an agent or a beta reader? That's just like for yourself.
Yeah, I would say I don't share anything with an agent or a beta reader until it's been pretty pummeled by me.
Victoria, what about you?
I'm a monster because I said I revise as I go. Like it really is this kind of loop process as I'm going. And because I've planned it all linearly, you better believe that like by the time I hit the last page of that book, I like format the document and hit send.
What?
Like it's like about a third draft at that point, but it goes straight to the editor. But then it comes back to me, and I do probably like 6 months of revision. Like it's passed back and forth. I do 4 rounds of revision for every single book, like big picture, character and plot, tighter line, edit, copy edit, like every single book. So like, but I know my process at this point, and I know the level of polish, fake polish, like polish that will then my editor will have to unpick to get to what's beneath. But by the time I've done that, it's probably been with me for a year to 2 years, and it has to go to somebody else. It has to get as far away from me as possible, or I'll start deleting it.
Well, that's the thing with when you're sending it to an editor and you know that they might be making big cuts. You're like, well, what if I've like agonized over the scene and like made it really beautiful? And they're like, no, we don't need any of this whole like it's a whole writing is a wild career. Krystal, what about you? When you are reading your drafts, do you make notes or do you just read, start to finish?
I get to the end and I just feel like I'm empty of words, and I've kind of like poured out everything I have, and it's someone else's problem now. So I hit save and I hit send, and it's my editor's problem. And then I don't look at it until I get my notes back from my editor, and I don't think about it. Honestly, I'm like, I'm going to think about something else. And I think that is a really valuable part of the process for me, because then you come back to it with really fresh eyes. You get your notes back from your editor and you can look at the story very objectively. Whereas if you're too in the weeds of it, you feel very like attached to certain things, certain characters, certain scenes, certain sentences. And if you have that break and you have that opportunity then to look at it as a book more objectively than a story that you're living in, I think that is a very, very valuable part of the process for me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I know I mentioned that I do co-writing, and I think it means that I at least have those the books I co-write are always the most polished first drafts, because I'll do a chapter, send to my co-writer, she reads it back, does notes, sends it back. So we're literally just like editing like as you go, which with my own books, I am not that careful. It's until I'm like, yeah, editor, come in, come help. This is an interesting question from Carla saying, tonight, you all spoke of magic as almost as a heritage, something passed down to family. In all 3 of your books, the major relationships between female family members. How do these type of relationships, so mother-daughter house, or Gallant, and Our Crooked Hearts, and Sisters and House of Hollow, how did these type of relationships shape your plots, in particular, the need for secrecy and cost of magic? So we touched on that a little bit, but I do think that's really interesting, the idea of magic as a heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Discuss. Who wants to go first?
I will go first. Yeah. So again, I love the idea of Dana's story being a paranormal tale that's got like this kind of clean arc, or so you would think, but then it's got like this long kind of tentacle. That's too creepy. Ew. That's too close to body horror. It's just, there's an open door, right? And that door is always open, and like the past can always come creeping in. So it's just so fun to play with that in like very literal ways. The costs of magic, as I said, even as a kid, right? Like you don't want magic to come too easy, because if, like all of us here on this panel, you are desperate for magic to be real, you know that you have to sacrifice to get it. And you know that you'll never find it unless you're willing to like pay in blood or whatever it's going to take. And I think even when we're like 6 years old, we know that. So yes, magic with costs, and magic that kind of involves the people that you love, which is like the greatest cost of all. That's a kind of storytelling I'm always going to want to explore.
Magic, yeah, the mother's like, in Gallant, it's unusual for me because the mother's completely absent. And not even to the point where like, because Olivia has grown up without a mother, she doesn't even crave one. It's not that she wants her mother in her life. She just wants to understand. She just wants to solve a mystery. And so the mother, and this is a tiny spoiler, but the book's been out for a little while. But like the mother manifests in the story, not only through the pages of the journal, but when Olivia gets to Gallant, the mother manifests as a ghoul. And like literally becomes this thing that is haunting Olivia, this heritage that is drawn where she only exists as an essence of magic, as an object of magic in the story. And it's probably the most direct time I've ever done that. But it's like, there's a lot about language in this book in terms of seeking a voice and seeking an understanding. And kind of the big issue between Olivia and her mother here is that Olivia is nonverbal and ghouls don't speak. And so they're constantly trying to find a way to translate narrative between the two of them. So it is actually like a handing back and forth of story.
I love that. Krystal, what about you? What do you think in terms of like, yeah, the heritage of magic? Because that plays definitely into House of Hollow.
Yeah, I think, again, magic as birthright is kind of wish fulfillment for me. And the idea that someone has been hiding something you're entitled to as part of your heritage is, you know, something that as a magic loving kid and teenager and adult that I'm still hoping I will find that I'm somehow a magical child or the chosen one. And yeah, in House of Hollow, it's certainly Iris has been kind of, this secret has been kept from her, this heritage that she is entitled to. And I think it's also a way for you to explain your magic system to your reader, because there is a keeper of the magic, and they're the person who like has the magic, and then the heritage is being passed down to the protagonist. But it is, you know, if it's this thing that's inherited and that your character is entitled to, it kind of insinuates that someone is holding the magic and keeping it, and that it comes from somewhere. And then that's a useful tool for you as a writer to be able to kind of communicate what the magic can and can't do.
I think it's so interesting because all of you obviously feel quite similarly about kind of these concepts and themes. We've obviously written completely different books. I think that's also something that's so great about magic and about the cost of magic. And I think for anyone who's joined us this evening, if you're kind of exploring those, you know that no story has been, you know, told the way that you can tell it and kind of be influenced by that. I'm aware we've run over by a couple minutes, but there's just, so I'm sorry if I don't get to everyone's audience questions. So one is going to be a rapid fire because I think it's really interesting. And then we're going to end on one that I was planning on asking anyway about kind of what everyone's reading right now. So Amy said, do you prefer characters who are expected to be malevolent or kind of evil, but then turn out to be innocent and kind, or characters who are expected to be kind, but then turn out to be corrupt? Which one do you prefer to read and to write?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think my initial reaction is to say like characters who are on the surface, they look good, but then they turn out to be evil. But then I love the twist of like the evil character who does a good thing and is redeemed. I just love both of those. I think I prefer to write someone who is good on the surface and then turns out to be evil, but it's so satisfying as a reader and as a consumer of like movies and TV to have the opposite. I love both of those tropes for different reasons.
Melissa, what about you?
I mean, yeah, the unreliability thing in both directions is so much fun. I think like Krystal, it is fun to write someone who seems so good, but is hiding dark depths. But I find that I have trouble writing a really like straight villain, if you know what I mean. Like I morally gray villains who are themselves victims in some way are, I think, a lot more fun to write, and they're like what I naturally gravitate to in both cases. So something
and
a little
more satisfying to read as well. If you're just like, this person is evil because you know, I'm less satisfying as a reader. And I think you do write really interesting, even in, you know, fairy tales where you would think that things could be quite black and white. You know, I feel like you have nuanced villains. They all have their own backstory. Victoria, what about you?
I really love writing people that we assume are bad, and then mostly because I like making the reader make a snap judgment about a character, and then over the course of a book or a series, forcing the reader to revise their assessment. So because I think the more we understand about a person, the harder it is to vilify them. And so I just really like taking a character, shading them as like the darkest edge of gray in the beginning, and then over the course of a book or series, forcing you to understand that you like misplaced them on that spectrum.
I mean, if we're looking at it's vicious, right? If you're looking at Vicious, I just remember I was like, is it called Vicious? You have so many books. In Vicious, like that is basically the concept of Vicious.
Exactly.
Oh no, it is so. And I do love that when you've got someone being good and then they're secretly evil, they get a really great speech. So it's
Monologue.
yeah, here's what. And then to wrap us up, I would love to know, and as would Ellen, what's a book, or you feel free to recommend too, you've read recently that you loved and would recommend. I'm going to jump in on this one. I've read, it's coming out, I think in January 2023. It's the new Emily Wen Zhao. I want to say it's Songs of Silver, Flames of Fire. Silver and fire are in the title. And it is extraordinary. It's like inspired by Chinese myths and legends and kind of like epic soap opera, kung fu battles and mysticism and mountains and treks and romance. It had everything I wanted. I was lucky to read an early version of it. And I read it on a flight, like a transatlantic flight, while wearing a baby, which goes to show you how good the book was. So definitely put that on your TBR. I think it's going to be massive. Just Google Emily Wen Zhao and flames and silver and fire. That's my recommendation. What about you guys? What have you read that you've loved?
I've read, actually literally just finished it yesterday, keeping in our fairy tale vibe. This is How to Be Eaten. Of course, I'm not gonna feel it. It's called How to Be Eaten.
Oh, good cover.
Okay, and it's basically a retelling of like the female victims of fairy tales as if they're in a support group, but it's like a modernized, like them kind of like coming to like understand their trauma. It's so good. Maria Adelman or Adelman, I don't know how to pronounce it, but How to Be Eaten. Very dark, very weird, very short, very good.
That's amazing. Krystal, what about you?
I actually have a copy here with me of Her Majesty's Royal Cabin by Juno Dawson. And I just was chatting to Juno last night at Waterstones for the launch. This is an amazing, like, modern witchcraft book that is like steeped in weird British bureaucracy. And it's so fantastic. It's this super like feminist, modern witchcraft with like issues about politics and trans rights. And I think this is like Juno's best book so far, and it's the first book in a trilogy, and I would encourage everyone to go and pick up a copy.
And then Melissa, what about you? What's your...
I'm gonna be rapid and give you 3 recommendations for 3 new witch books. First of all, Rhys Nielsen's Deep in Providence. It came out a couple months ago. It's brilliant. It's like this very eerie, sad, like beautiful contemporary fantasy about 3 girls whose best friend dies, and the 3 remaining girls try to summon her through witchcraft. And of course, things go badly, but it's like gorgeous as a character study, and it's just, I love it. I keep talking about it like every event. Today, S. Isabel's The Witchery is out, and everyone should read that. And then Wild as the Witch by Rachel Griffin is out 1 week from today. And it's just like this warm, beautiful Pacific Northwest set love story with witches and owls. And yes, so witches. In closing, witches.
All about the witches. Well, I love that. I could literally keep talking to you all night. But I'm sure people need to go to bed, have dinner, do things. But this was such a pleasure and such a delight. Thank you so much for all being brilliant authors and humans. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. And don't forget, if you don't have these books, you can get them from Waterstones. And yeah, hope everyone has a great night. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was so lovely. I really appreciate it.
Bye.